He's already instructed.
Yes.
So welcome everyone for what is obviously a very important day for us, and will be honed further by the middle of about the 10th of December when we do decide finally what we're going to go out and consult on. So I'm going to move on and take the apologies. We accept apologies from Councillor Casey, Quacks and Stewart for absence, and Councillor Mike Lee for absence on council business. Is that for lateness or absence? Absence, okay. So
Happy to move.
Happy to second.
okay, thank you. All those in favour?
Aye.
Declarations of interest, anything jumping out? Nope.
I think I should say
Confirmation of the minutes of the 27th, I'm happy to move those. Seconded by Councillor Simpson. No errors in those minutes, so I'll put the motion. All those in favour say aye.
Aye.
Against, there's none. There are no petitions, there's no public input, no local board input, no extraordinary items have been brought up, no notices have been given. And we go to the main item for the day, which is the mayoral proposal, and we'll pass straight on to Mayor Phil Goff.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I hope the rest of the meeting proceeds with the alacrity that we have for the first part of it. Look, can I begin by formally moving the recommendation before us, which is simply to receive this proposal.
I'll second, it's fine. Yep.
Mr. Chairman, as you and members of the governing body are aware, this is the first step in our 10-year budget. This is my proposal to you as members of the Finance and Performance Committee. You'll come back to me with your suggestions and your thoughts on it at the meeting of the governing body early next month. And then we go out to the public, of course, and the public have a chance over the whole of the month of March, I should say, to put their feedback into what we are proposing to make this city a better city over the 10-year period that this budget proposal covers. In many ways, the 10-year budget is the most important agenda item that we as a council have to produce during the term of council. It's designed to give our city direction. It's designed to focus us on the issues that are most important. I think every one of us here agree that Auckland is a great place to live. It's our responsibility as members of the governing body to make this a world-class city and to provide the infrastructure and the amenities that enable us to preserve the quality of life in the city and the ease of doing business in the city in the face of an unprecedented population growth of now close to 50,000 extra people a year, bringing with them another 800 cars on our road each week. The importance of this budget is to allow us to provide for the growth that the city is experiencing. The problem is this: we have been under-investing for years in the infrastructure that Auckland needs, and we're now starting to pay the price for that. Under this budget, we will be spending at least $5 billion more in infrastructure, for transport, for water, for parks and community amenities over the next 10 years than the council had budgeted to spend in the last 10-year plan 3 years ago. Probably the most pressing issue that Aucklanders feel is the level of congestion on our roads. And this budget increases our capital expenditure for transport over the 10 years to something between $11 and $12 billion. The truth is, none of us and no Aucklander wants to spend more and more of their daily commute stuck in gridlock. The regional fuel tax that I'm proposing we should adopt is critical to our ability to tackle this problem. I said repeatedly in the mayoral campaign that I would be pushing for a regional fuel tax, and I'm pleased that we have a government that is willing to work with us so that we can implement that. The regional fuel tax will replace the interim transport levy of $114 a year imposed on every rateable household. We can honour the promise that this is interim, and we can replace that interim transport levy with a fairer and more user pays system that also delivers twice as much money for investment in infrastructure as that levy did. Currently, a pensioner in South Auckland pays the same as a big corporation whose vehicles are on the road day and night, 7 days a week, and that is grossly unfair. In an ideal world, of course, all of us want more and better services without having to pay for them. That's just human nature. But people know that that is not the real world. They know that we as Aucklanders have to contribute our share towards building the transport infrastructure we need. We simply can't rely on the people in Invercargill, Whanganui and Gisborne to meet our costs. We've got to pay our fair share. At the same time, we expect the government that takes most of the tax revenue that all levels of government take in this country also to contribute a fair share and to acknowledge the pressure that growth is putting on our city. Aucklanders know we have to act, and they want us to act. Doing nothing is simply not an option. They have indicated to me, and I think to many of you, that they prefer a regional fuel tax over the other options that we might consider in terms of raising extra money for infrastructure. They prefer it over a general rate rise because they don't know where that money is going. They prefer it over tolling. They prefer it massively over selling off of strategic assets to pay for this infrastructure. I want to now look at the second issue, Mr Chairman, that I think is of critical concern to Aucklanders, and that is in the area of housing. Tackling the crisis of unaffordability and of shortage of housing requires us to provide the infrastructure like transport, water, parks and community facilities that allow housing development to actually happen. Only by ensuring that infrastructure is provided can we ensure that land that we've zoned for development actually sees development on it. Under the last government, we raised close to $1 billion through the Housing Infrastructure Fund and through special purpose, the special purpose vehicle. We'll continue to work with the new government to progress alternative funding methods that recognise the constraints that we face in terms of our debt to revenue ratio and what we need to do to ensure that our borrowing remains prudent and preserves our high AA credit rating. I'm sure that the new government, with their commitment to affordable housing, to more social housing and homelessness, understand the challenge that we face and will want to work with us. The third priority area I've set out in this 10-year plan is the issue of the environment. We pride ourselves on being a beautiful city, a great place to live in terms of our natural environment and with good cause. But that beautiful environment is marred by the reality that every time it rains, just like it is out there now, our stormwater flows into our wastewater, and our wastewater flows into our streams and onto our beaches. Recently, Councillor Holson, Councillor Simpson and I launched Safe Swim at Mission Bay. And what Safe Swim shows in real time is that too many of our beaches, for too much of the time, are not safe to swim in because of those wastewater overflows. We need to address this problem now. Council after council has partially addressed it, but often left it in the too hard basket, and council after council has left it for another generation to resolve. I'm proposing that we change the current plans that say that we will address this over 30 years and reduce the wastewater overflows into our harbours by over 80% within the next decade. I think the proud legacy of each of us for this council will be to agree to a proposal that will see our water quality improved and our beaches cleaned up for the sake of our kids and our grandkids. I'm proposing in this budget 2 targeted rates. The first targeted rate will be $1.30 a week if adopted, and it will be used to separate stormwater from wastewater and to improve the capacity of our wastewater system to fix the problem. Together with the efforts of Watercare, this targeted rate will enable us to make a substantial difference and help us towards the goal of us being a clean, green, unpolluted city, and I commend that to the Council. The second targeted rate I've set out at a rate of 40 cents a week, but there is an alternative option of $1.20 a week under a more ambitious option. Both options are designed to enable us to do more to protect our natural environment. Page 3 of the Herald today and the news at the moment is replete with the risk that we face with the spread of Kauri dieback disease. Is there an Aucklander that doesn't admire and want to protect the magnificent kauri trees that mark our landscape? Is there an Aucklander that isn't worried about the rapid spread that we've seen through the Waitakere Ranges over the last few years and worry that that is going to spread to other iconic areas such as the Hunua Ranges? That small sum of money will enable us to do substantially more to tackle that problem and other problems like weed and pest infestation that is damaging our natural environment. The reason that I'm proposing these 2 targeted rates are that they are absolutely transparent, enabling the ratepayer to see what they're spending and where that money goes, and the difference that adopting those rates and implementing the measures that I'm proposing will make for the environment that they are so proud of. On the issue of rates, I'm delivering on my promise to keep rates as low as possible while also delivering the services that our city needs. In the first 2 years, I'm proposing that we continue to hold the general rates increase to 2.5% and then move to 3.5% thereafter. However, when we take out the interim transport levy and include the 2 targeted rates that I've proposed, the net general rates rise increase will only be 1.4% for the average residential property across Auckland. That's the property valued at just over $1 million. Let me repeat that figure, a 1.4% net increase. It's not sufficient just to ask Aucklanders for more money again and again. Aucklanders also tell all of us that what we want is an efficient council that provides value for money. We've been able to deliver lower rate increases in part because we have worked to find savings without cutting services. The Section 17A value for money projects have highlighted where we can make some significant savings. We need to capture those savings to reinvest in quality council services and infrastructure. As part of the Council's drive to deliver value for money, the Chief Executive Officer has been set new performance objectives that this Council adopted at our last governing body. They have a focus on better quality spend and a focus on ensuring that spending in areas like travel, salaries and staffing levels are sustainable and reasonable. Finally, there are a couple of other things that I want to comment on that will have drawn the interests of councillors. We have, of course, for a number of years now been selling surplus properties and reinvesting the proceeds of those properties in infrastructure spend. I'm proposing the sale of 2 further properties that are non-strategic assets. They are the Graham Street Council property and the downtown car park. That will return us some hundreds of millions of dollars. I won't be specific because we may be going onto the market for that purpose, but that will enable us to do a whole lot of things that we couldn't otherwise do to improve our city and our town centres, the waterfront and community facilities. The second issue that I think will be of interest is the proposal to apply business rates and also the targeted rate on accommodation where these businesses are in the sectors A and B that it applies to online providers of accommodation such as Airbnb. Last year, when I introduced the targeted rate on accommodation, I undertook to hotel and motel owners that we would provide a level playing field. It doesn't matter whether you go in and check in to the reception and do the booking by phone, or whether you book online. There needs to be a level playing field so that businesses in the same field are paying the same rate of residential rates and are liable to the same rate of a targeted rate on accommodation. Finally, Mr. Chairman, this is a budget of choices and priorities. Of course, we'd like to spend more in a whole lot of areas. There's not a councillor around this table that hasn't got a dream and a vision of an area where they think that they can help make a better Auckland by spending more money. But in a constrained environment, there are always limitations. And our first responsibility as a council is to be fiscally prudent, and that is what I am being. We need to make some hard decisions over the next few months, and most importantly, we need to listen to what Aucklanders have to say on this proposal. But it is up to us, as elected representatives, to lead the discourse on the conversations we need to have around those hard choices. I want to thank all of the councillors who have provided informed and constructive feedback over the last 5 months as we have worked on the long-term plan, the 10-year budget. I'll be talking, of course, to all of you over the next couple of weeks and over the next 7 months on the issues, and together I believe we can and we will produce a budget that works to make Auckland a world-class city. Thank you very much.
Right, I'll just before we move on to any questions and then comments afterwards, just remind you we've got a workshop on the 6th and another workshop on the 7th of December to further work this proposal and any counter proposals and additions. Then we have the meeting on the 11th of December where we will actually finalise what we're going to recommend for the LTP consultation, and then on the 7th of February we adopt the consultation documents. In between that time, the Audit and Risk Committee will be running the ruler over the whole program. Before that 7th of February meeting, that will be a special meeting being called by the Audit and Risk Committee. So that's a little bit of a departure, but it's something that our new chair of the Audit Committee is proposing, well not proposing, saying we will do. So that's just to make sure we get the process and everything totally right. So any speakers? Questions? Councillor Cooper.
It was just a question about the Airbnb being added onto the targeted rate, and I do have an interest in hotel, but I don't have an interest in Airbnb. Because there's not a map in front of us and I wasn't involved in the previous targeted rate conversation, I'm just wondering, when you talk about geographical zones A and B, does this correlate with the current targeted rate around excluding Franklin, Rodney and Waitaki Ranges local board area?
Yeah, it's the same boundaries that we adopted last time, Councillor, and it's designed that if a person is providing accommodation in those areas where the targeted rate applies, that will apply to Airbnb if they're operating at a particular level, and that's set out in the mayoral proposal, in the same way as it would apply to a motel or a hotel. There's a formula set out
Just
in the proposal.
propose that those are the areas that are excluded that are actually promoted by ATEED, and they are quite the areas that people go. And so I'm just wondering whether that policy will actually extract as much as you would like to extract, because it actually, those people do benefit from the ATEED advertising.
I should first of all point out that the business rate will apply if the accommodation provider is determined to be a business wherever in the city they are. The targeted rate will apply where it currently applies. There was a debate, as you're aware, around what areas should be in and what areas should be out. It wasn't a perfect science. We may work in the future to try to fine-tune that. But in this particular proposal, I'm not recommending a change in the boundaries that apply. That will be something that will be looked at in the future. It will also depend, of course, whether there is any alternative that the budget, that the central government proposes in terms of something like a bed tax. It's been too early to ask the new government what its intentions are in that regard. But if they determine that a bed tax is to be introduced, then we may be looking at a different ball game altogether.
I suppose I'm just, Mr. Chairman, my comment is that if you live in Takapuna or Henderson and you do Airbnb, you'll be charged. But if you live on the West Coast or Matakana and you do that, and for most people Airbnb isn't their business, it's a bit of extra money, which is fine. But it seems a little unfair to target one part of the community which aren't businesses but are basically homes being let out. And not the others. But I understand the complexity of trying to do that at the moment. But I'd ask that when we look at that again, it's quite different from businesses.
The targeted rate, as you'll recall, was designed in part to reflect the degree of benefit that regions got from events that were funded by ATEED on behalf of the tourist industry. I've got no problem with looking at fine-tuning that in due course, but it's not part of the specific budget proposal in front of us.
Councillor Cooper, but it is an ongoing piece of work because we're quite conscious of what they're doing in Queenstown, which is really honing down on defining what is a business. So, and I think you saw in the paper last week is the top earning Airbnb in Australia was $5.3 million a year in income, which is quite astonishing.
Airbnb can be a bigger business than some small hotels by a long shot.
Exactly my point.
Yeah.
Councillor Holmes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do have a couple of questions, but I'd like to, is it possible to just combine the comments I'd like to make and the questions in the interest of time? Mr. Mayor, I want to thank you for your budget. I made no secret of the fact, and you and I have had some discussions about my concern of the sort of looming 2.5% rates increase and my worry that we could be taking the city backwards without fully addressing the cost of this fast-growing city. But I want to express my support for your two targeted rates. Obviously, they are in the area that my committee is responsible for, and I think you've actually grasped the huge concern that Aucklanders are expressing for the state of their waterways, the state of our harbours and the state of the environment. And as you say, quite rightly, I think all of our emails are absolutely chock-a-block full of people expressing concern around Kauri dieback. So my first question, I'll just signal it, is when we discuss on the 11th this proposal in greater detail, I will just be asking why you've set the overall rate for the environment at just a little bit lower than the 450 million that would have given full effect to all of our policies, and I think we can explore that on the 11th. But in saying that, these are critical issues, and I think there is an honesty about the way that we have ring-fenced these pieces of funding, and we can go honestly to Aucklanders and say, if you care about this, this is what it will cost, and this is what we will actually buy you with this sum that we're asking you for. The other reality is, as councils around the country set their budgets, I think Auckland was a little bit in danger of being seen as the council to cry wolf. Oh, we can't do anything, we need to go to the government and the rest of the country for money because we're too scared to put the rates up. And that was certainly feedback that I'd had from councils around New Zealand. I think we're taking an honest and transparent approach by doing this, and I acknowledge you, Mr Mayor, for doing that. However, there are going to be some areas where there is, you know, I think a bit of fiscal tightness in the budget that you're proposing, and particularly our cultural spend and our spend on sport and rec. And I think we may need to, rather than simply put the rates up, we may need to look at some movement of budget between transport, for instance, and culture, sport and rec. And I think that is a discussion that I'm sure we'll all be open to. And finally, just again to say, this is our time to actually be brave. We are facing unprecedented growth in the Auckland region. And having just come back from the conference overseas where people were at pains to explain the change in the last few weeks of the fiduciary requirement on international directors of large companies now to fully cost and fully take into account the impacts of their decisions on climate change, the environment and social outcomes, we should do no less. And I think this is a time for us to fully take into account the cost of the decisions we made, and exactly as you say, not leave it to further generations to clean up behind us, which is what has happened previously. So thank you, Mr Mayor. I think we're absolutely heading on the right track, and particularly given the area of responsibility that you handed to me, thank you so much for listening to the concerns I've raised. It's appreciated.
Thank you very much, Councillor. If I can just pick up on a couple of your comments. The first thing, and this was a comment made at an earlier workshop, and I've absolutely taken it on board, is that this process needs to be transparent, and it is. If you look at page 16 of the budget document, we've set out precisely what the impact of removal of the interim transport levy means, what the general rates increase means in terms of the annual cost to households, the average annual cost, the percentage cost of that increase, and the weekly cost. And we've done the same for the targeted rates. Under the natural environment levy, there will be some options that will go out for consultation. We can spend a smaller amount or a larger amount, and probably we could spend either of those amounts and still keep within the net increase being less than 2.5. But this is a chance for Aucklanders to tell us what they're prepared to pay for. You know, I said before, and I know you're passionate about all of the areas in environment and community, we could usefully spend a whole lot more money, but we have to balance that desire for a better Auckland with the ability of and the willingness of Aucklanders to pay that price. I agree that councils around the country, some of the councils are looking at double-digit rate increases. We've said on transport infrastructure, if we're paying for transport infrastructure, those that use it most should pay the proportionate amount, and that's exactly what the regional fuel tax does. If you're a pensioner and you're hardly using the roads, and certainly not in peak hours, you shouldn't be paying the same as a big business that's got a fleet of trucks out there hammering the roads day after day. It is a user pays principle, but it is a fairer principle. And what we're saying to the other New Zealanders, Councillor, we as Aucklanders will be paying a higher amount for our petrol in order to meet the cost of our transport infrastructure. That money, just to be clear, because some of the media reports weren't necessarily clear enough, that money that we take in the regional fuel tax will be hypothecated to spending on transport. It won't be taken off and misdirected or redirected to other areas. Again, it will be absolutely transparent and people will know what they're paying for. But the conversations we've had, people said, we would rather you be transparent and say that money that we're giving you there is going to spending in that area there. Because Aucklanders have told us, they've told you that they're worried about kauri dieback, they've told all of us they're worried about water quality, they've told all of us that they're worried about congestion on the roads and the need for us to spend more money on infrastructure. So that's precisely what we're doing.
Councillor Newman.
Thank you. I reserve the right to speak. I just wanted to understand.
Sorry, just point of order on that. Just for clarification, Mr. Chair, we're speaking and raising questions at the same time.
I am allowing it, but if he's wanting to only ask a question and then
okay.
speak
Yep,
later,
no, that's fine.
I'm agreeing
I
to
wanted a
that.
question as a clarifier in relation to how we are addressing what I think are quite important needs in relation to our contributions policy. Specifically, are we changing that policy as part of this proposal? Where is that addressed? Sorry,
can you clarify?
I'm talking about development and reserve contributions.
Oh, okay.
I believe that does need to be addressed, and that is an area where I have tremendous sympathy, but I'm wanting to understand how that's going to be picked up through this proposal.
I have not addressed that specifically in the proposal that you've got in front of you. It may be in some of the background papers that will accompany this proposal that will go out to you either tomorrow or on Monday. Consideration has been given as to what the appropriate level of a development contribution should be. In my mind, a development contribution isn't a way of milking the development sector, but it is a way of meeting the real costs of that development. And in some senses, this will depend on the evolving government policy in this area. But as we move forward, I would be looking at saying, if you are developing in an area where it's more expensive for us to provide services and infrastructure for you, then that development contribution could increase within the limits that legislation allows us to increase that amount. I think there needs to be further discussion around that point, but I'm not ruling out that in some cases the development contribution, we could look at increasing it. But can I invite Andrew to comment on that?
Good afternoon. We'll report on proposals for changes to the development contributions policy in February, and those changes you wish to consult on with the community will consult on alongside the long-term plan process, so decisions can be made at the end of the May at the same time and link that process together. That will include discussion on the appropriate way to set the development contributions price, including the pricing for reserves.
Thank you.
I think the desire, Councillor, is that as the city grows and grows outwards as well as intensifies, we must maintain, if not improve, the level of green open space we provide for a much larger population. I'm also conscious, as I know you will be, that when we put the development contribution up, it's not the developer that pays for that, it's the ultimate consumer.
Yep.
But the development contribution should, in my mind, properly reflect the cost of providing the infrastructure for that development to take place. I think those are the principles around which we'll be working. I hope that's helpful.
Reserve the right to speak.
Councillor Walker, Wayne. Walker.
Sure. I've got a question first, and then I'll make some comments if that's appropriate, Mr. Chair. And the question to the Mayor is: do you envisage that there will be more funding available for the art gallery and also the zoo? And I appreciate that that's been in the media recently because of the dire state of funding around the art gallery.
Yeah. Let me just clarify something, because I did listen to the national program on funding of the art gallery. I have been around the art gallery with Dame Jenny and listened to her concerns. And let me say right up front, I think the art gallery is a fantastic institution providing a great service to Aucklanders. The amount of money over the last 4 years, I think, that council has put in has gone down by $2 million, but it's been replaced by the gallery raising more of its own funds, so the actual spend on the gallery has gone up by $1 million. I'm conscious, and I asked the gallery about this, that 60% of the visitors at the art gallery are international visitors. And it's not my belief that we should be rating Aucklanders to pay more for the ability of international visitors to go into the art gallery free. The art gallery has started down the process that the museum has been working on for many years now of a donation as a contribution, but I believe that that could be developed further. It is a world-class gallery, and the people that are coming here from China, from Japan, from Canada, from the United States, from Europe, they are used to paying to go to their art galleries. And I think that that creates a real opportunity to put more funding into our art gallery without putting more of a burden onto our ratepayers.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So if I can just make a few points.
Yep.
And basically they're commendations, Mr. Mayor. First off, my commendation around the scenario-based approach, the options that you're putting on the table around environment funding. That's great because it gives people of Auckland a choice, and I would hope that part of that choice that's implicit is a larger amount for funding of regional parks, and I'm talking about new regional parks because at present that's zero. The other commendation is around the targeted rates being based on capital as compared to the present transport targeted rate, which is just one rate,
Levy.
one amount across the board. That's really important because it's fair. It means that outfits like Sky City, large capitalised operations, pay a fairer share. It also means that if we look at the percentage change that we're talking about of 1.4%, if we actually look at it across properties, it means that smaller value properties are going to be having even less of a percentage change, which means that arguably Aucklanders with less means, and I'm assuming that a lower value property may well correlate with an Aucklander that's harder up, those people are going to be significantly better off, and I think that's fair. The other point that I'd make, and again it's a commendation around the fuel tax, is effectively that is a carbon tax. So it's sending an important signal out to the marketplace that if you're using carbon-based fuels, you've got an incentive to use an alternative, and that goes to electric cars, electric bikes, and so on. So I think that's really important. My commendations around that. And I'm also pleased to hear the comment that you're making about around the prospect of conceivably modifying or taking out the present accommodation targeted rate if the government brings something in. I think that is good in principle. So thank you, and a number of commendations.
Thank you, Councillor. Can I just comment very quickly on two issues, because I think at least two of them are really significant. I'm worried, as some of the people around this table are, that with the revaluation, the catch-up, which means that the value of some of our outlying suburbs has gone up, that the rate increase in a percentage term will be higher on some of our lowest income areas. And, you know, look, for any one of us around this table, $1.70 in targeted rates a week is a fraction of what we'd pay for a cup of coffee. But for our folk that are often on low income, with family responsibilities, it can be more. So this is a way of producing equity for our communities that are under more pressure. So thank you for your support for that. That's exactly what we are trying to achieve. On the fuel tax, likewise, it is really important that we send a message that if you convert and you get an electric car, there are costs associated with that. You've got to provide a charging station at home and so on, but you are actually using less expensive imported fuels, you are burning less carbon, and you're contributing less to the global warming phenomenon that we have to respond to. So in a small way, the regional fuel tax also provides just that extra little bit of incentive for people who are in the position to convert their fleets to electric. Thank you very much for your comments. So,
Councillor Walker, just to be quite clear on the the capital value. So if you look on page 13 and 14, you'll notice that we're working on, or the Mayor's proposal is working on a 25.8 differential rate. So we're giving a nod to business to say we are going to install that. The proposal is to install it at what is the long-term differential strategy. So rather than going down 0.5% each year for 18 years, we're trying to just focus it back, and it's a slight nod to business in that regard.
I think it's fair to add to that, Mr Chairman, that because businesses are consuming far more of the road use with commercial vehicles, they will be paying a bigger percentage towards our roads than will the residential ratepayer. And it won't apply to the farmers because the tax won't be on farm use or non-road use. So the people in the barrier have said to me, will we be paying more for the fuel that we have to use for our electricity generators? And the answer will be no. There'll be the same exemptions that apply under the normal road tax provisions.
So is there anyone that's just got specific questions rather than questions, comments? And just to Councillor Sayers, the birthday boy.
Yeah, happy birthday, Councillor.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr Mayor. A couple of questions, three, Mr Chair. First one, just elaborating on the meeting on the 11th, to what depth of obviously this is the Mayor's proposal and key items that he'd like to look at, but associated with the budget there's other items that a bit deeper into the paper. Is that the opportunity when we'll have a chance to discuss those?
Well, there's two opportunities. We'll be discussing them at the workshops because that's where there's more, free flowing, and then come the 11th, those who wish to put up amendments and alternative proposals, they will be considered and voted on. And if and in the past we've been reasonably generous with our voting pattern to allow further consultation where we think it's only fair and appropriate. And if the majority says we go out and consult on this or as an alternative, that's what we do.
Okay, thank you. And my second question was probably more directed to you, Mr Mayor, and I think it's probably fair to give the opportunity to answer this question, and that's because your proposal is a combination of rates and targeted rates and the regional fuel tax, and we're selling it in the paper as an overall rate increase of 1.4. There could be potential criticisms that it's for Aucklanders. It's going to cost them more because they're having to pay for their petrol, and it's the equivalent, therefore, of a rate increase of 6.2 is a figure I've seen. So I just wanted to give you the opportunity to comment on that, please. Yeah,
no, it's not equivalent to a rate increase of 6.2. It is set out there absolutely transparently, using not my figures, but the figures provided to me by officials. For the person with an average property of just over $1 million, they will notice a rate increase of, on average, 1.4% over what they were paying last year. That's real. Are they also paying a regional fuel tax? Yes. That's exactly what I promised, and you heard me promise it in your ward and at every meeting I did around the city. And that does not, of course, apply in the same way as a rate increase. It will apply as a user pays charge on those people that are using the road much more frequently. So I think that it's wrong to say this is a 6.2% increase. It is exactly what it is. It's set out clearly. It's 2.5% general average general rate increase. It's targeted rates in two areas, and it's the removal of the interim transport levy, which is a rate demand, which brings it down to the 1.4%. So you're paying 1.4% on average, but you are also paying more for the fuel that you use on the road, but that also produces at least double the investment that we need for our transport infrastructure. And if we are going to increase our infrastructure investment, then guess what? All of us, particularly those that are using the roads most often, are going to have to contribute towards that cost. The targeted rates are there as an option for people to consider. But all of the feedback that I've had is that people believe, and I hope the member believes, that we need clean water in our harbours, And if we need clean water, we want to bring that forward and we want to tackle the problem, then we've got to be prepared to contribute to the cost of doing so. But it is absolutely transparent in those documents, and deliberately so. There is no smoke and mirrors. It's all clear to everybody what we're trying to do, and I thought the Herald did a very good job this morning in setting out precisely how that worked, and commend them for the clarity of their explanation.
Thank you, Mr Mayor.
So the other aspect of the fuel tax, which wasn't there with the interim transport levy, is there is that demand management element to it, which is pretty important. So if people want to avoid paying it and they choose to go on the trains, so be it. And I'm sure if the buses increase, it's unlikely. Well, I can't say that because it's Auckland Transport, but whether prices would go up, I would doubt it, because they're going to have to pay the fuel tax as well. But if the patronage goes up substantially, then that should certainly block that out, more than enough. Councillor Fletcher.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. I've got a few questions which I'll kind of incorporate into some of the comments that I'd like to make, and I'm probably following on from Councillor Sayers, and that is, what does this actually represent if you bring all of the components of the budget together? And perhaps that is something that we could bring certainly to the 11th of December meeting, and putting officers on alert, that I'd like a breakdown on it, because it raises the vexed issue of the whole matter of capital valuations, and where people need to have certainty. We've just been through the revaluation exercise, and I think for a lot of people who've lived in their home for a long time, just by virtue of where they've happened to buy in the first place, they may not have the incomes to reflect the capital value of the properties that they're living in. And I wonder whether the Mayor had given some thought to that, and because there's not a lot of referencing here into those measures and mitigation other than just what has been in place for some time in terms of the Department of Internal Affairs. And I think there probably are people who are saying, well, that's all very well if your property's been valued at that amount, but what does it mean for me? I mean, we could have come in today with a scale showing what that threshold might be, depending on the value of your property, because otherwise it just becomes speculative, and I don't know that that's entirely helpful. So, to me, I looked at this, and it is, it's like a good movie. There's the good, the bad, and the ugly in it, and I kind of like that, and I like the fact that the Mayor, I challenged Mayor Brown over a long period of time that his was not a green budget, his was a brown budget, and we have moved from just talking about transport into some of the much more complex areas to do with environment, which I, for one, really genuinely welcome. But I think it's because I feel so strongly on those green issues, and I think it's good that the Mayor is wanting to carve out a legacy on the environment. But it's because of that. You can't be flippant when you're talking about transparency and accountability. We need to take all Aucklanders with us on this journey, because this is looking at saying, we're just going to get on top of the long-standing issues, certainly ones that I go back in history, and a lot of us have tried for a long period of time, and those that have been around for a while, and I've certainly drawn the Mayor's attention to it. Part of putting up rates by 10%, which may be highly unpopular, was to actually address the stormwater issue and to address the need for capital depreciation for legacy Auckland City. So I'm not averse to taking these things on, but I'm saying when we do it in such a way that it's going to take the entire community with us, because I think that will be really, really important. And on the transport side of things, golly, Christmas has come early for the Mayor. If there hadn't been a change of government and there hadn't been the certainty in and around the fuel tax, this could have been a very different proposition today. And can I say, I do think that this is probably the best way to go. It's been my view for a few years now, and so Christmas has come early, on the transport side of things. And I think National have to really reflect on that, because what was, in terms of transport policy for Auckland, was just too little too late. You know, it was a bit grudging, and it reminded me very much, it was a repeat of the 1999 election, where we were trying to get back the rail corridors and we were trying to do a whole range of things, and the mood changes. And I think a lot of Aucklanders will now say, well, you know, that should have just happened. So I'm not challenging the Mayor on anything in terms of the transport spend, but I would like to, in workshops and as we go into the meeting on the 11th of December, I really would like to interrogate some of the greater detail. We received in workshops a number of funding options, funding scenarios, and I haven't quite been able to reconcile where we've landed in the mayoral proposal with regards the options that were presented to us. So I guess I'm wanting a little bit more certainty on what's in and what's out, and I appreciate that that might have something to do with what the government might have to say on things, but I do think we need a little bit more detail on that. I am disappointed, while I'm very pleased that the Mayor has picked up on the work of the former council in terms of the opportunity to divest ourselves of the downtown car park in Graham Street. I think that is the right thing to do, and so I welcome that. But this is our opportunity with the LTP to actually go out to the public, and you can't raise matters later on. I mean, when we've tried to raise issues in the past, we kept being told, well, you know, that's the role of the LTP. But if we don't put something in here in terms of open space acquisition for regional parks, if it's not in the LTP, where are we going to land? You know, we know the one thing that Aucklanders truly value, they truly treasure, it is our regional parks. And yet we are largely silent on regional parks in this document. So I'm saying that there should be some provision, because that's the purpose of going out to an LTP. And the other thing that I'm disappointed in, and that is the port. I have expressed this to the Mayor personally, but I feel that we could be divorcing the issue of land ownership, separating it out from the commercial business of the port. There were opportunities that would have been available to us if we'd shown the courage to actually pick them up. And this is the opportunity with the LTP. So you're consigning this issue basically away for 3 years. Now, you can probably imagine that the Mayor will come back to me and say, oh, well, you know, the government's now going to do a port future study, whatever else. The reality is the port is not going to change in the short term. But in the short term, there were opportunities that we could have looked at for the people of Auckland whilst holding on to that incredibly valuable land. And I think we've been shortchanged in the decision to disallow that, as we've been shortchanged in not allowing the public to come in and make formal submissions on the, you know, it was a decision of the council, but I think that was pretty disappointing. Coming to the explanations from the Mayor on the online accommodation, I mean, these were questions that were asked at the time that the accommodation supplement was put in. We did interrogate that, and we were assured that there wasn't a problem in terms of online accommodation. Now we're hearing there are. We were also assured that we would spend a bit of time looking at the science of the geographical zones that were put in place on the accommodation supplement, which I think were grossly unfair. Now I'm told that there hasn't been a lot of work done on that. Can we expect that work during our workshops? Can we expect it by the 11th of December? We do know that, you know, there's a lot of ATED money goes into Franklin, a lot of ATED money goes here and there. I think if you're going to come up with these sort of packages, they've got to have some science behind them. They've got to be robust. And we're already seeing the changes that are being made now because they weren't properly dealt with in the first place. So I think, all in all, yes, we are trying to grapple with a lot of challenges with Auckland's growth, but this budget creates a lot of uncertainty for middle-income Aucklanders, and I think we need to interrogate that. I think we need to understand what the ramifications that are going to be, and I'd like the Mayor to give some consideration to some of the transitional measures, because there could be, you know, quite a few Aucklanders that didn't plan on moving out of Auckland, that when they see their rates bill might have to come up with a change of circumstances. And I, for one, don't want to be part of that. So I just hope that before the 11th of December, there can be more transparency, if we're into transparency and accountability, into what this actually means and how it will flow through in terms of capital depreciation. May I finish? In just terms of the business differential, I acknowledge that there has been recognition of the business sector and the contribution that it makes to employment, and so I welcome the opportunity for that to kickstart again. So by and large, I think there are a few things I'd like to see changed. Today is not the day for amendments. They can come on the 11th of December. But I welcome the opportunity to have the debate and hope that the officers can come a bit better prepared with charts and give us a better idea on what this is going to translate to. Thank you.
I don't know whether, Mayor, you want to respond, but I remind you that Clint Eastwood, though, was a man of great outcomes and great action, but few words.
There's a message in there, Mr Chair, I'm sure. Yeah, look, if I can I thank the councillor for her comments, and I think a lot of those comments are very helpful. Let me just pick up on the capital value, the basis of putting the targeted rate on capital value. I listened very closely to Councillor Fletcher's helpful comments from, last week I think it was now.
Workshops.
One week goes into the next, and I think, Councillor, you made a big point about equity, and that is exactly the principle that has driven my decision to put to you a targeted rate that is based on capital valuation. If you look at pages 14 and 15, I've set out in detail the impact of those two targeted rates, water quality and natural environment protection, according to what the value of the property is and what that would mean in terms of the extra annual payments. So we have gone out of our way to try to be transparent about that, and of course the summary of rates on page 16 sets out precisely what the overall impact would be. But I certainly take the councillor's points that you can be asset rich and income poor. And if you look at page 12 of my document, you'll see exactly the way that we've addressed that. The revaluations can throw out a person in their anticipation of what their rate increase might be. And I've indicated there the council mechanisms for providing payment plans and postponements to deal with any problems that might be caused. We take that seriously, and that's an option open to people. And of course there is the rates rebate scheme that provides support for ratepayers on lower incomes, and not everybody is aware of that. So maybe we need to do more or keep doing more to make sure that people are aware of the assistance that can be given to them in that area. Thank you for your comments about the legacy issues. This is not my legacy, this is our legacy. It's a legacy for all of us, and I acknowledge the work that you've done for many years in our parks and reserves area. But if we can clean up our water, if we can protect our natural environment, that is something that I believe all of us can be proud of. In terms of the regional fuel tax, I'm not quite sure whether it is an early Christmas. It is incredibly helpful. But, you know, Christmas presents are free to the kids, but the parents pay for them. And anything that we do in terms of our infrastructure, yeah, we will be paying. Nothing comes for nothing. So we will be paying in a different way, but in a way that gives us more money to do more infrastructure and allocates the costs more fairly. In terms of the divestment, I think this council has expressed on a number of occasions the majority view that people aren't keen on selling strategic assets, and I count myself as part of that group. But I don't regard the Graham Street building or the downtown car park as a strategic asset. If the investment in those services, and probably would put a caveat over the downtown car park, that what's valuable for the downtown car park is the airspace above it, not simply the car park. They would probably be required to keep those parking spaces, but they would be allowed to develop above it. We don't have the money to develop above it, and that provides a much more value than an ordinary ageing car park building would normally provide. And if we can do some of the things that Councillor Darby has talked about in his committee in terms of other projects for the central city, the waterfront, our town centres, our community facilities, I think we have to look at the option of selling something that is non-strategic if we think we can get better value for our constituents by so doing. But that is something that will go out for discussion. On the port, very quickly, you know, I thought about the separation of land from operational. What's really valuable to us as a council is the land the port sits on. 77 hectares of central business district land that could be developed in the same way that the Wynyard Quarter has been developed to great value for the city. But you can't talk about doing that separation when there is huge uncertainty over where the future location of the port may be. I'm hoping that the government study, which we will, I've been assured by the Minister, we will have input into the terms of reference for that, will provide a direction forward on the basis of evidence. And when we've got that, we've got some certainty about what we are talking about. I want to free up the CBD. I'm not sure that Northport or Tauranga are the right solutions to transferring our port to there. In fact, I'm sure that they're not the right solutions, but we need to look at that on an evidence-driven basis. But we're not in a position to say we can make major changes now till we know what the outcome of that report is.
So
on the online accommodation, can I just correct you? I never assured anyone that there wasn't a problem. In the meetings that I had with the hoteliers and the moteliers, I said, I recognise there is a problem, much wider problem than the targeted rate. It was about business rates or residential rates, where Airbnb, a new IT-driven form of accommodation, were not playing on a level playing field. So you could have a hotel just down the road here where some of them were privately owned and used as Airbnb, paying less rates than the accommodation provided by the hotel. Plainly inequitable. I acknowledged that. I said I'd go away and do the work on it, or get my officials to, rather. They've done that work. We're now ready to go back to them, and we've been talking to Airbnb about that, and they've been quite cooperative. On the geographic areas, I think I've answered that in relation to Councillor Cooper's comments. So thank you for your comments. I appreciate the support in some critical areas there, and we will have the opportunity in the workshops to explore some of those other issues that you're talking about.
Mr. Chairman, I am taking from what the Mayor has said that on the issue of the port and the commercialisation of the business of the port, that if there were certainty at some future point that the government should come back with its study complete, as you know, we can't give consideration to this unless there's some special consultation or alternatively through an LTP. I'm taking from the answer that the Mayor has given us that he would entertain the idea of special consultation if we can get to that position. Also, just to highlight that on the matters of difficulty for ratepayers with there are no new initiatives here, and we have demonstrated, I think, for the last few years the inadequacy of the provisions that Council has in terms of tools in the toolbox and the thresholds. So I just put that on the table. But the special consultation and the LTP for matters of significance, you know, this is our once in 3 year opportunity to see it, and it'd be good and encouraging to know that you would entertain that if there was a sense of clarity in and around the government's position.
Let me just say something very simply on that. We can't consult about something where we don't know what the outcome is yet, and I'm sure the councillor understands that. That's true also of some of the transport proposals where we don't know where the government's going to come down to in terms of the Auckland Transport Alignment project. And what I've said in a line that shouldn't be overlooked in that, we can't do what we can't do now, and it may be that we have to transfer some of the decisions that we'd prefer to take under the long-term plan to the annual plan consultation process for 2019. So where a decision is made that has a material effect and we might want to reconsider something, we would have to do that in the process of the next round of consultation on the annual plan. I think that just makes sense. Thank you, Mr Chairman.
And Councillor Fletcher, can rest assured that that will not be forgotten under my watch. I think it is totally important that we do separate the land from the operation, and the Mayor points out that the land is the most important thing. It is the most important thing for the long term, but sorry, equally important for me is the value of the port itself. I personally believe that we can enhance the value of the operation there, and it's something I think we will perhaps be looking at over the next year or two because of the port study and other things that may happen to come up. Councillor Watson.
Oh, thanks. Just make a few general comments, if that's okay, Mr Chair. I realise this isn't the time to dive down too deeply. I just sort of confine my comments to some of the key elements that the Mayor's outlined in his mayoral proposal here. I'd congratulate him on the figures indicated for the rate rises. It resisted the pressure for some, and not least of which some of the people around this table, to go with a higher rate rises over the forthcoming decade. But I think the Mayor's quite rightly gauged the public unwillingness to pay any more than that. Indeed, the capacity to pay more might be more accurate. And if that ends up being 1.4% when it's all cut and shovelled, well then all the better. The growth figures, Mr Mayor, that you comment on in your proposal are pretty stark. We all know them. Last year, Auckland's population up 50,000. Forecast to reach a population of 2 million by 2028, and every 3 years go by the size of the city of Tauranga. All I would say in respect of that is I hope those statistics are emphasised a little bit more emphatically to the government than was the case with the last council with the last government, because I think that's very pertinent to our long-term future here. Obviously, the centrepiece of this long-term plan consultation will revolve around the regional fuel tax, and I know the Mayor, you've been at some pains to try and come up with something that is fair, that doesn't adversely hit one group more than another, and comes up with a reasonable amount of money to address our transport challenges. At 11.5 cents a litre, I think the AA estimate is that'll be about $125 a year for your average motorist. I think that might be a little bit conservative. If I look at the capacity of your ordinary car and a fill, so it might well end up being more than that, particularly out in the outer suburbs, but I'm sure that will come through the consultation process as to what the true cost of that might be to people in specific parts of Auckland. And when we do that, I hope we take that on board because clearly you want to be as fair as possible and to avoid perhaps unforeseen consequences where perhaps the last people we want getting stung more by this are the ones who actually end up paying more. But as I said, no doubt that will emerge during the course of events. And I would urge you, Mr Mayor, to continue your advocacy for GST return on rates. I know you've done that thus far, and I know the AA also make a point about the tax on the fuel excise being amounting to roughly 10 cents a litre too. So while we have signalled that we want to go down the road of the regional fuel tax, I think it's important to keep putting those issues out before the government also. You've mentioned, Mr Mayor, that the transport is obviously the key driver for this, large parts of this proposal, and I think what is going to be really important in this consultation and in the detail that comes is this notion of equity across the transport network. Hasn't always been the case in the past, and I think there'll be a far greater demand from different parts of Auckland to have the precise nature of what emerges from this investment being very clear for all to see. So my expectation is, and I'm sure there's other councillors around the table, that while we understand there will be certain areas of emphasis by virtue of the sheer sum of investment, that everyone is being seen to be getting a fair shot, or at least getting some consideration on that. So I think the level of detail that will have to accompany the regional fuel tax proposal and the transport priorities will have to be far greater than was the case in the last LTP. Just finally, Mr Mayor, there's a couple of other ones there that will get picked up in the course of events. Future of Eden Park, maybe invite the Eden Park Trust Board to have a say in their own fate. Similarly with non-strategic assets, I think we might find some interesting views on what the community define as strategic. Certainly if the example of the West Park Marina is anything to go by, if that's the case of things to come, and certainly and the value for money that we know that you have been driving very hard. I think there's myself and a couple of councillors that can perhaps chuck in another few cost savings that might help us in that drive as well. But overall, thank you, Mr Mayor, and I certainly look forward to seeing what the people of Auckland have got to say about all those various elements.
Thank you very much, Mr Chairman. Very quickly, just the advocacy for the GST, the return of the rate, the GST component that's added to our rates, another 15% on every dollar is put on by the government in GST. I've got that in the proposal there as something that I have and will continue to take up with government. I have yet to receive from the former or the current government a strongly positive result on that. But I believe that there is equity in what we're asking for. I'm saying to any Minister of Finance, I don't want to come to you every time we need something, cap in hand, and say, could I have funding for this project? If they can devolve more money back to us, then they will expect us to meet more of our own costs without ad hoc requests to them to help. So I think from a government perspective, that could be quite good. And the fact that the government doesn't pay doesn't pay rates on a lot of the property that they own in Auckland is another way. Between those two things, that's $280 million a year, and you can imagine what we could use that for in terms of infrastructure. So I'll continue to push that. On the equity across the whole network, if I had my finger on the page, but I've set out some of the things that I think needs to be in the Auckland Transport Alignment Project. It's on page 6. It's not an exclusive list. It's just a list of examples. But I've used those examples to indicate that whatever we pay for out of the regional fuel tax, it'll go into the ATAP pool, and it will be not simply for one project, it will be for a variety of different projects across the whole region. And some of that may be towards CRL, some of it might be towards light rail, some of it might be towards extending the busway up north, and some of the other proposals that are currently in ATAP. So I think it's critically important that nobody goes away thinking, I'm just paying this regional fuel tax for that one project. It'll go into the pool, it'll be hypothecated only for the use in transport projects, but it will be designed to be fair to help the whole region with their transport needs. And can I finish just on the future of Eden Park? I've had discussions, sometimes informal, with the chair of the Trust Board. He knows my concerns, that Eden Park have got plans that if they were to bring Eden Park right up to standard, it's something like $750 million. If we were to replace Eden Park, it could be half as much again, or it might even be double that cost. I don't have the money for those sort of projects, but I do know that Eden Park is an asset that will need money being spent on it, and no money is being put aside to spend on it. That is an unsustainable position over time, and over time we need to address that. I'm one person that has always said, I don't want to put hundreds of millions of dollars more into a stadium that can't make money and that may be in the wrong location. But that is something we're going to have to look at over time. I'm not proposing anything in this document, because how can I propose something when I don't have the money to do it? It doesn't mean to say it doesn't need to be done. It's just we've set our priorities, and the America's Cup actually is a more urgent priority in terms of any extra capital investment we're making rather than the new stadium. That's why the new stadium is not part of this proposal. Thank you very much for your comments, which are helpful.
I have Councillor Newman, Cashmore, Simpson, Darby, Hills and Sayers, and Councillor Newman and Sayers are having their comments, so they ask questions before. Councillor Newman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Look, I want to acknowledge the Mayor and I want to acknowledge the intent of this proposal. I say that because the Mayor did campaign with determination and transparency, particularly around the regional fuel tax. The Mayor has a mandate and I respect that mandate. I too have a mandate and a duty of care to speak for the people of Manurewa and Papakura. I grew up in Papakura and there are property owners in Papakura who face 62% increases in their property valuation. I live in Manurewa and there are people in Manurewa who face 50% increases in their property valuation. I thank those constituents for their mandate and I do seek to convey their aspirations and their concern. Mr. Chair, the Labor government was quite transparent. It promised the means to apply a significant new tax on the motorists of Auckland and only Auckland. And in so doing, the application of the means of that new tax, it affects the people in South Auckland. 11.5 cents per litre, that's 10 cents regional fuel excise plus GST on top of that. Chair, ironically, there is a risk here that we end up taxing those in our community who can least afford, who have the least choice. And like Councillor Watson, I suspect, I have a suspicion that the propensity to tax will be designed to fund the investment that provides choice and amenity to those people who have the most. Blue-collar workers, the shift workers who live in Roscommon Road, the taxi drivers of Homai, the machine operators from Weymouth, they have limited choice. Chair, contrary to your view, I don't regard that public transport adequately addresses and provides a comprehensive alternate to all parts of the Auckland region. The mother with the pram and a couple of bags of groceries who lives in Cargill Street, or the shift worker from Freelanders Road who has to get to work at 4 o'clock in the morning, the bus services aren't necessarily as comprehensive as they are for you and me, Mr. Chair. And I have no doubt that through this debate there will be people who have built a reputation about the concerns of the car. They are going to be the ones who will embrace the petrol tax and those petrol tanks in those vehicles for the purpose of generating revenue that will be used to fund public transport. In other words, one mode of transport cross-subsidising another. But this is a debate, and it will be a debate about affording infrastructure. Chair, if the answer is trams, then no one's really asked me before what I think about light rail, but I'm actually quite suspicious of light rail as a so-called panacea for the infrastructure needs of the region. But I respect that the government has a right and a mandate to consider its priorities for ATAP, and it has declared that intention before the election. East-West Link has been discarded. My concern here is that Mill Road could be next. I'm very, very nervous about that, because if I am asked to go and say to my constituents who are facing 50 and 60% revaluations that they need to pay 11.5 cents extra on every litre of fuel for the purpose of funding infrastructure, it's not light rail, it's not trams down Dominion Road and Kerry Hill, it's trams down Dominion Road in central Auckland. I challenge my colleagues, Mr. Chair, to come out to my ward and to come and tell my constituents that that proposition won't hurt them. And you know what, Chair, I pondered this issue last Saturday night as I was sitting next to a blocked main sewer in the Takanini Reserve, and I did that because the lid had fallen down the drain. It posed danger to children. I am a councillor from South Auckland, and I have to address those things that affect my constituency. And it's not as glamorous as some of the issues that we face around this table, but it is pertinent to my community, and I have to speak for them, and I do so proudly. Chair, I want to commend the local boards for their initiatives that they have put forward. Maniarewa and Papakura, they have, I think, been quite modest and humble and tried to be as cooperative as possible. Papakura has merely requested an early commitment on park and ride, Maniarewa in relation to a park in Homai. And I want to thank the Mayor for his attempt to address that, some of these local issues, these important local priorities have sat there and they've waited a long time. And I know it's not easy, but these things are essential, and I think that as we move forward and we have these difficult debates on things like the fuel tax, that it's important to not lose sight on those things that we can agree on. And I share the Mayor's view, and he's expressed it today, about the cost of development needing to fall on those who trigger that cost. The causal relationship between the development community and what it does and the levies that need to be applied, they need to be properly priced, and we need to do more to move on from the days where we socialise the costs but privatise the benefits. The costs need to be better allocated, and if that's what the Mayor is going to advocate, then I will fulsomely support that initiative when that matter comes back in the new year. Chair, I represent a community where my days are sort of spent trying to address issues such as illegally dumped organic and inorganic rubbish, where we have issues of dogs off leash, where we have issues of poor planning decisions all over the place. And I accept that responsibility. It is an honour. But I need to say that it's important that Aucklanders are treated fairly and not simply on the basis of their postcode. And others will say, well, that's not how it works. But there will be people in my community who will feel this, and they will feel that this is a cynical budget. I think there are aspects in this budget which are very laudable, and I want to support it. But there is a cost, and I'm concerned that the cost is borne on those people who can least afford, and I will have to speak for them. Thank you.
Maybe the Mayor would like to comment specifically about Mill Road, as you're silent
look,
on it.
Just a couple of things. I'm trying to condense my comments because we might be here a long time. I didn't make any comment about the local board initiatives, and I should have, so thank you for raising that, Councillor. I think the local boards have really engaged in this process with a spirit of saying, yes, we've got to set our priorities just like the governing body does. Let's try and come up with things that are by and large reasonable, and they have. And to the extent that we're able to with the budgetary constraints, we're going to try to meet those initiatives, but there has to be a business plan that stacks up. We won't fund anything where there isn't a business plan that doesn't stack up. So we won't be able to do everything they're asking, but we will set out with the same spirit of goodwill that they have shown to try to address their needs. The other one about petrol, as the councillor knows, I lived not far from where he grew up as a young man, and I understand very, very well some of the financial pressures on people in Papakura and Manarewa. And I also understand that because I go through those areas every day, when I want to buy petrol, which I don't have to do with my electric car at the moment, but I do have to do for my motorbike, I can choose two different stations in the councillor's ward where the price differential is more than 11.1 cents because one station charges a whole lot more than the other. And I know that the price will be up today, and then tomorrow if the dollar goes up in value it'll be down. So there is that fluctuation that has an impact on our people all of the time. On the property valuations, you know, the fundamental principle that we must follow on the revaluations is that a property in one area, one postcode, that is valued the same as a property in another postcode, they should be paying the same rates. That's a fundamental principle. Properties of equal value pay the same rates. The unfortunate thing that's hit our South Auckland constituencies is that their property values were slower to go up and now they've come up. But they are still actually significantly lower than other parts of the city. But the capital valuation as a basis for our targeted rates is designed to reflect the needs of the constituents that you're talking about, Councillor, to try to keep the costs on those people down to the extent that we can, because they genuinely find it hard to make ends meet. But I think there was another point that I should have picked up. I'll come back to it if I recall what it was. But I'm taking on board what you're saying, Councillor. We are trying to be fair to everybody, but the principle of fairness means that, you know, it doesn't matter where you live. If your property is of an equal value, you'll be paying the same rate. I recall the other question. If not a regional fuel tax, what are we going to use to fund infrastructure? Because the people of Manarewa and Papakura and beyond, as Councillor Walker knows, he comes from that area, there is nothing more frustrating than sitting in your car with the car idling, consuming petrol, churning out CO2 and going nowhere because the roads are congested. So for every person that we can put on public transport and take them out of their car, that frees up the roads for others that do need to use their cars on the motorway. So I think that the way in which we spend that money will be equitable. You might be spending it on public transport, but getting people off the roads and into public transport helps those that are still on the road and are otherwise going to be gridlocked.
Mr Mayor, should we have any concerns about Mill Road?
I haven't put Mill Road in because I haven't had any discussion. I know Mill Road very well. I used to live on it. But I've had no discussion with the Minister around at that level of specificity. So I take the point about Mill Road. I personally believe that it's necessary because I can see when I travel, mostly I travel before the rush and after the rush, but when I am there during the rush, that road is gridlocked, and if we're going to create thousands more properties south of Mill Road and in Drury, we do need an alternative form of road transport as well as the electrified units that we'll put south of Papakura.
Councillor Cashmore.
Thanks, Mr Chair. And I acknowledge the Mayor and the work that goes into performing these budgets. It's not easy. I'd bring on, Mr Mayor, the work you stood about Mill Road. It is a main arterial road for one of the fastest growing areas of the city, but it is also where over 80% of the aggregate comes from to build the city. So those 4 or 5 big quarries in that central and eastern Franklin area provide a huge amount of material to build our roads, to build our bridges, to build our buildings. So that is a whole part of the Mill Road corridor, which is absolutely critical and has been ignored for far too long. Thank you also for acknowledgement that roading users, cars, trucks and your motorbike, will be the people contributing to this fuel tax and not stationary engines, not fishing boats and not machinery on farms in the north and south of the region, because they do not use the road. The interim transport levy, Mr Mayor, you've always given me a hard time about it, and I'm happy to accept those discussions and those points of view. However, it has done its job, and I'm glad to see that it will finish 30th of June next year, because it was designed to prove to the government that Auckland and Aucklanders wanted to have a roundhouse discussion about how we solve our roading and infrastructure needs. And it did that. The government came to the table because this was the first time in 15 when we stopped reducing Auckland Transport's CapEx budget and increased it. And that's what brought the government to the table. It helped us deliver ATAP, which is a 30-year transport plan based on data and facts and not political influence. And therefore, we've got a good basis upon which to build a really solid investment in our transport infrastructure going forward. So I thank you for recognition of that. I would hope that we're going to see, sir, some further work around the central interceptor and water quality initiatives. I understand why all ratepayers have to contribute to this by the targeted rate. I would be interested to understand how the water care component of that sits and our component as Auckland Council, and where we are going to go with maybe a Crown Infrastructure partnership model with the government about how that's going to progress forward, because it certainly is a candidate and a very good one for that particular product. I'm also very pleased to see that you have reinstated the reducing quantum for the business rates, in recognition that they are the lifeblood of our economy, whether they are small, medium or large businesses, but they are an essential part, and we need to recognise the fact through a reducing rate of their contribution to the city. The last point I'd have to make is concerning the increases in capital values, and Councillor Newman makes very good points. There's been large increases out in his part of the ward and certain parts of the north as well, but it is not that value that directly relates to your rate. Just because your valuation's gone up by 60% does not mean your rates will. And I know Councillor Newman wasn't suggesting that, but the fact has to be well recognised as how your rating sits as compared to the average. Your valuation sits as compared to the average. That is what depicts your rates. And I'm hoping, Mr Walker, sir, that we will see, if not in the next week or two, but certainly in the new year, the actual data sheets around each ward's increases average and how that affects the three different categories of rate, being residential, business and farm lifestyle. They were most useful last time to actually put factual data around rate increases or decreases as compared to the suspicion and innuendo that can flow. So all in all, Mr Mayor, I think a job well done to you and your team and to our staff. The city needs the certainty of a 10-year plan. It needs the certainty of a 30-year growth plan, whether that be transport or housing, and that gives us an opportunity to deliver things that we've never been able to do in the city's history before. So thank you, sir. Well done.
Thank you very much, Deputy Mayor. Very quickly in response, I think both of us sat behind convoys of quarry trucks in that part of the country, and I know exactly what you're talking about. On the ITL, look, let me acknowledge immediately your role in dealing with a critical situation, and that was the best tool available to you. I don't detract from that at all. I understand exactly what you did it for, and I understand the importance of getting ATAP up and running so that we could make some progress. But as you say, it has finished its job, and we've got a fairer way and a more appropriate way of doing it now. On the Central Interceptor, I think that's a good point, and I have in this document, if we can fund that off the council group books, it's currently on Watercare's books, therefore it is on the council's books, that would give us a whole lot more headroom. And it is, in my view, which I share with you, an ideal candidate for something that could be funded in a different way and give us the ability to do more in infrastructure generally. And I agree with your points, the other points that you made in your contribution. Thank you very much for that.
Councillor Simpson.
Thank you, Mr Chair. Look, a lot of other councillors have asked some of my questions. I'm not going to give comments. I'm just going to have a couple of brief questions. On the regional fuel tax, Your Worship, can you make sure that before we have our workshop there is potentially some work done about the impact on public transport as a result of the regional fuel tax if it was to go through? You know what the income's going to be from vehicles, so I think it's really important to see if that relativity. I just want to make a quick comment on your quick comments you made about the art gallery, and maybe I can talk to you later, but my understanding is that you may not be 100% correct on the income. When they get income, they often get it from a piece of art that is donated or a work, and they have to put that down as a dollar figure, and that's the income. It's not actually OPEX income. It's gifted works, and that has a dollar value, and then potentially around sponsorship for particular exhibitions that come in. That's income, yet it's not OPEX income. So I just would just mention that. I want to know when we're going to potentially get the information on the rates impacts for our wards specifically. Do we have an indication on when that will be? Will it be before or after December meeting? And finally, just some words, if I may, Your Worship, around the government's timing on their legislation, because you say in the document by the end of 18. Do you mean end of 18 calendar year or end of 18 financial year? And do we know exactly when the government would have to pass this legislation for it to be included? And then you say that if it didn't pass the legislation in time, you would consider keeping the ITL. Do you mean will consider or you will keep it?
Okay. Thank you for those questions. Let me go through them one at a time. Firstly, on the regional fuel tax, the impact on public transport, it will have an impact on public transport. We'll try and do a bit more work to get you greater clarity around that. I'm also conscious, of course, that what we want to do is replace diesel buses with electric buses, and we need to do that. That's happening right across the world now. It's at an early stage, but it's progressing very, very rapidly. And I would imagine that within 5 years you will see new buses coming on the road being electric rather than diesel, which would be great from a whole variety of perspectives. And in fact, we're trialling the first 2 of those electric buses in Auckland early in the new year. On electric light rail, on the bus corridors that are most congested too, will replace the use of diesel with electricity, and that will help the public transport. On the art gallery, the figures that I'm using are figures that have been given to me by officials. I'm more than happy for you to have a look at those and cast your eye across them and see if you find any discrepancy in them. But what those figures show is that the revenue for the gallery has gone up, not down. The overall expenditure of the gallery has gone up, not down. The council contribution in the last 4 years has certainly gone down by $2 million, but they have found ways of generating their own revenue, which you and I have both discussed in regard to Regional Facilities Auckland and regarded as a very good thing that they're raising more of their own revenue. On the rate impact on wards, I'm going to, in a second, ask Matthew to explain that, because there was another question about that as well. On the timing of legislation, I have in writing that it will be next year. I don't have in writing by what month of next year. I have expressed my desire to see that the legislation come in so we can implement the regional fuel tax to replace the interim transport levy at the time that it goes out. There may, however, knowing legislative timetables quite well, there may, however, be a month or 2 gap. If that's the case, we can live with that. If it was going to be longer than a few months, then I've foreshadowed in my document that we would then need to reconsider that. But I'm hoping that that is not going to happen, and I'll be using every endeavour, and I hope other colleagues around the table will use their endeavour with the opposition to make sure that that is not unnecessarily held up. Sometimes the legislative timetable is beyond the control of a government. Mostly it's within their control, and I will continue to push to get that up as soon as possible. I can put up with a few months without the revenue, but if it was going to be, say it was going to be 6 months, then I'd really start to worry about that. Could I ask Matthew just to talk about when we'll have the ward-by-ward rate increases following on from revaluations?
Sure, happy to do that. So, look, the team are undertaking by Monday to have quite a comprehensive range of documents out to you. They essentially encapsulate, I've counted up around 15 or 16 options that are important to the budget, and that will include transition matters, revals, the impact of this rating model on that. So that'll all be out with you on Monday. It'll be attached formally to the document going to the December 11 committee, and we'll have the opportunity in workshops next week to talk some of that through.
Thank you, well done.
Thank you, that's very helpful.
Councillor Darby.
Oh, thank you, Chair, and acknowledge and congratulate the Mayor. You've presented us with your annual budget, and now your first 10-year budget, and you're waking up to what local government has to do. That is, we have to plan long, as opposed to your former parliamentary role, which isn't required to look as far out as local government is required to do through statute. But you're more than getting to grips with it, and I sincerely acknowledge how you've reflected the concerns of Auckland and Aucklanders here. I can see the 3 key focus areas that you're homing in on, and there are, of course, members, the very key focus areas that we've highlighted in the draft Auckland plan, and that is absolutely we've got to face up to the housing crisis. There's just no running away from that one. We cannot ignore that. Addressing the public transport deficit, and it's significant and rising, and taking responsibility finally for a severely degraded natural environment. And it's a travesty how we've got ourselves in this situation. And since 2008 with the GFC, there has been no appetite of former legacy councils or the first two councils here at Auckland to really address the significant environmental degradation. So attacking those three key areas, I can see you're doing, and whilst doing that, you are endeavouring to keep the good old lid on rates. So three key areas, and those three key areas have been well telegraphed by yourself, the councillors here, local boards, and I think Aucklanders you've been listening to as well. On the subject of alternative financing and revenue sources, I see the regional fuel tax as an interim measure, like the interim transport levy was interim, because this can't endure. We know that Treasury knows that excise duties have got an end date, and it's probably mid-2020s as we see the arrival and renewal of the vehicle fleet with electric vehicles, and then after that there'll be the autonomous fleet renewals. So I view this as an interim, and it says to me that we need to get cracking on what's next, and that is likely to be a congestion busting charge, smarter pricing for transport, and that's going to be quite different to, I think, how we understand it today. It's going to be quite a dynamic tool, and that's where I want us to work hardest at, not just think that we've got a regional fuel tax over the line and we can rest easy. We cannot rest easy on how to finance a 21st century city, and it cannot be relying on that good old general rating tool. We've got to wean ourselves off that, and you've signalled an intent to wean ourselves off that reliance. So that's good. On the water quality and natural environment targeted rates and levy, I totally support that. I've got some caveats at this stage. I do want to see, as we work through the funding of the massive spend on the Central Interceptor, that is a massive project that we've inherited after the former council, Auckland City Council, had a bit of a she'll be right approach. It's coming home to roost, that one, and it's affecting a lot of Aucklanders, but I'd like to see further analysis of where the benefits sit and where the costs should lie on that one. I know we've done some work on this, but I'm still not at the absolutely convinced stage that it is a truly all Auckland region responsibility to pay for. And I know that those beachfront homes in Cox's Bay where you cannot swim when the tide's in, if you do, you're doing it at great risk, they will be the biggest beneficiaries of this work. Now, I also know that representing the North Shore, the people in Shoal Bay and Little Shoal Bay, they will also benefit, because those wastewater plumes that we've seen through the modelling wander on up into those areas as well. Less so for up the East Coast Bays, but I'm prepared to examine that further with you constructively to arrive at a good outcome, because there's no shying away for the need for the project. Also, I am really encouraged to see the greater focus on the natural environment. As I said before, well overdue, and it's real catch-up mode there. But I also want to remind us all that the biggest contribution that we can make to the natural environment is to transform our transportation away from a car-centric, car-dependent Auckland to one where the first choice is public transport and active transport. And all the research in the world says that is the biggest move a city can make to address the biggest gains in the environmental area. In terms of disposing of the so-called non-strategic assets, yep, Graham Street, we don't need to lease back there, unlike 135 and our 135 Albert Street building. There's no advantage from the work that we've done. We're in no better position because we're required to lease back. Graham Street's an example where we can dispose of, I would say, quite a valuable asset to the private sector. But I would like us to do even more work in that area. I am aware that the real estate that we're leasing over in Takapuna, where we have a chamber like this size, is used twice a month, 3 times a month. That is not efficient use of the real estate, and I know that we've got some of our most expensive leases in that particular building. So the other work that I'd like to see done going forward, and I don't want to see the accelerator, the foot on the throttle of this come off, I'd really like to see us work a lot harder to understand the true cost of greenfields growth, and I want those costs to be hinged back to the greenfields growth. Because at the moment, Auckland regional ratepayers right across the region are subsidising greenfields growth significantly. ACIL, something that I've been talking to you about for some time. Can't see the value in holding a CCO that costs us $1 million a year when we've dispatched the film studios to someone else, and they are effectively reading a couple of 6-monthly and annual reports. And there we've got an easy win of $1 million a year, and as you highlight in your proposal, $10 million over the 10 years. Local board initiatives, I can see the sum of some $200 million there that you've identified, and within that I can see a good win again for my community, and thank you that the Lake Road project of some $40 million is in the mix for confirmation, hopefully, next year, subject to the feedback that we'll get from our communities. Further work to be done also, I really emphasise the work on the Local Government Rating Act. There's been some talk about picking up the rates on Crown properties. I'd like to go a lot further in that and not just focus on Crown properties, but review, get the new government, a willing government, to review the whole legislation. It's overdue, and that would enable us to rate wharves, e.g. Ports of Auckland, and even private jetties that are in the coastal marine area, runways, e.g. the biggest listed company on the share market that we own 22.4% of, and that's Auckland Airport, where the runway is not rateable, and hospitals and other Crown properties. So, Mr. Mayor, I do commend you, like I think everybody around this table is commending you today, and we're on the way to firming up something in the new year that is going to be lasting and beneficial to Auckland. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor. I won't go over the areas where we're in agreement, and that's most of the areas that you've raised, but just touch on a couple that I think I should comment on. The regional fuel tax, I haven't used the word interim, but you are absolutely right. Carbon fuels will go out progressively, probably starting within the next decade. And so it's not long-term in that sense. In the short term, the regional fuel tax will encourage people to make that change from carbon fuels to electric cars, and I hope that that will be positive. I have talked to the Minister for the Environment about that, and at a certain point, those of us with electric cars will need to pay something towards our road use. But in the short term, where it's quite expensive maybe to put your charging facilities in, etc., we still need the incentive, and the regional fuel tax will contribute towards that. The Central Interceptor, yeah, look, I agree. It's a critical project. It will make a huge difference. If we can fund it where it doesn't appear on our books, that would be a big advantage to Auckland. And I have raised that with government. Haven't yet got a formal response. But I am more optimistic about a positive response in that area than perhaps in one of the two other alternative forms of fundraising that you and I have talked about. Non-strategic assets. Let me just say this. I have had the chance to work with officials, and I think we have some considerable savings by rationalising our footprint in terms of our properties. We have a lot of properties from legacy councils that you've mentioned the North Shore that are not well used but are still costing us a lot of money. And that's another area where we'll be striving to find savings that we can reinvest in a much more positive way. ASIL, I didn't mention that, but hell, in my mind, with all due respect to the people that we've had running ASIL, no criticism of them, but it's $10 million in savings that we can make without losing, in my mind, anything. Would we turn away $10 million of savings over the next decade? No. Each one of you around this table could use that money locally. And the local board initiatives touched on the Rating Act review. Yeah, look, there's billions of dollars worth of property that use services but don't pay rates because they're government owned. And that, in my mind, is not a fair go, and that is something that we should continue to push government on. Thank you very much for your contribution.
Councillors, we have 6 more speakers, and Councillor John Walker and Councillor Collins haven't indicated they want to speak. So we're going to have a 5-minute break, an 8-minute break. So we'll come back on that clock at 25 to, because health and safety requires after 2 hours we have a break. Councillor Hills.
Councillor Hills.
Councillor Hills.
Councillor Hills.
Okay, sorry, I'm just getting myself sorted.
Okay, right, please.
Are you finished?
That was a good contribution.
Yeah. I was just waiting for everyone to listen.
Have you finished? Oh, good. Next.
Thank you, Ross. I just want to, congratulate the Mayor and you, Ross, and Desley, and everyone else who's worked on this. It's not an easy task at all. So I think it's a good foundation. It's a good place to start. I'm not going to comment too much on my feelings on everything, but I think some of this is, do we do it or do we not? Can we be the council that cleans up the harbours, or do we once again leave it to someone else? Can we be the council that, addresses transport in a bigger way? The last council definitely did with the City Rail Link and other things, but we need to once again step up and figure out how to do this. Just on the petrol tax, I mean, that is nothing new, and the ATAP gap is nothing new either. We had ATAP, which was fantastic. It finally got us to a place where we could agree on projects together with the government. But even when it was announced, there was a $4 billion gap. In August, the Transport Minister at the time, Simon Bridges, released an update that said we had a $6 billion gap. And so this petrol tax, yes, it's fantastic to fill, but it's only going to fill $1.5 billion of the gap. So we need to also be realistic about, great, we can fill part of the gap, but there's still a gap. So this is sort of, how do we do this if we don't support things like this? So this is one part of the gap, and I think that gap has probably grown since Simon Bridges, it went up $2 billion in 1 year. I can imagine it's already growing. So this petrol tax is not to pay for rail from the city to the airport. It's to fill that gap, and one of those projects is the rail to the airport, and that was already on our books before this government. So that was already in our thinking. It was part of the plan, it was part of ATAP, and it was part of the work we put into the annual budget last year. The other thing is, the last government did put 15 cents a litre or more on petrol, and 9 cents of that was actually for the roads of national significance. So this time we're saying we need this for Auckland-based projects, and we can't just keep sitting stagnant and keep the traffic still. And I don't think we think about the investment that has come through the interim transport levy and the other investments the last two councils have made. I mean, in my ward alone, in my trip alone, we have double deckers there. We got those a year ago. That is a massive investment in the area, and now there is no one left behind on Oniwa Road in the mornings. We have 10-minute trips going past my house when 10 years ago it was 40-minute trips. It's $3.15 now. It used to be $4.50 for the same amount. That's $1,000 savings people were taking. We had a 63% increase in transport users in the last 7 years, and that didn't come by accident. That became because the council invested and had to invest. But what we also need to say is the government needs to step up and fill that other gap. The other thing is I want to acknowledge the local boards. Angela, I think, is maybe the only chair here, which is fantastic, but the 21 local boards really did step up, and it's not easy. You've got your local residents asking you for 100 projects, heaps of things to do in your area, but we said to them, look, we can only get one over the line, one big item above and beyond what your current budgets are and cover, and they all stepped up and they all came up with a project or had a project already on their books that was in dire need, much like one of the projects in my ward, which is the Birkenhead grandstand, which is largely a renewal project. It's a failed asset that needs redoing. But the local boards have really come up and said, these are the things that our community needs, and we are looking like to get most of those projects in the budget and prioritised, and that's hundreds of millions of dollars that we're getting in there. The other thing, with the harbour, and I do semi-agree with Chris around, who pays and where, because obviously North Shore had separated waste and storm water in the old councils, but we are one council now, and the water is one. We've got to protect the mauri of the water, the whole water and its connectivity. We know that human waste that comes out of the stormwater systems when it rains does come and circle around in our beaches and in our harbours and down the back through Kaipatiki and everything. So we know the water quality is bad everywhere. And if we can get things done, I mean, we've had $50 million of water care projects just in our ward. Those are 2 projects just this year. So things are getting done already, but we need to ramp it up for the whole city. And people keep saying, clean up the harbours, clean up the waterways. I can't believe we can't swim here. But they don't want rates to rise, or a lot of people don't want rates costs to go up. But it's going to be a choice for us and a choice for the people who submit on this 10-year budget. What do you want? We either leave it, or we still have human waste in our oceans, in our harbours, which, you know, we want to have America's Cup, and we want to support things in our area. We want to have kids swimming in our local beaches. We've got to make sure that it's actually at a situation that doesn't make them sick. With the other thing is, and you know, I'm happy that we focus on the big stuff. I'm happy that we are really making a big point of the infrastructure, of the water, of the environment. I mean, we've got the Rahui that is happening in the weekend in the Waitakere Ranges. That's something we can't just ignore, and that is something that we're going to have to address right across the city again. And we know that in places we do it, the birds come back, the bush comes back, but we know the current budget is not going to keep up with the decline that we're seeing. So that's another important area that we as a council, but also the public, are going to have to decide. Do we do that, or do we not? It's not so much about funding it, it's are we going to do those things? The other thing, the Auckland Art Gallery and other issues, we're also going to be a council that's not just about money and infrastructure. We also have to make sure that we protect what we value right across the city, whether it's the events, the tourism opportunities, the libraries, the art galleries. And I do agree with Councillor Simpson and Councillor Hulse around the art gallery funding. That income that is showing on those books, you know, is around funding that cannot be used for operations. You know, the previous council spent $120 million on that asset. It won massive awards, and we can't underfund it. I think we do need to figure out a way to increase that budget, or at least keep it what it was, because it's an asset for the city, and people give and give and give to that gallery, and a lot of people expect those items that they've given to be seen for free and not be charged for. The other thing is, I think voluntary donations are fantastic, but the problem is if we make it compulsory for overseas visitors, that means everyone who walks through the door is automatically assumed an overseas visitor unless they prove otherwise. So we have to be careful about that too, because how do we limit the people going through those doors? How do we make sure, you know, when a young person walks through, that they have some way to show that they are a local resident, or a homeless person who does not have a fixed address in Auckland? How do we make sure that those awesome facilities for our community are made sure that everyone has access, and we don't put barriers there, because the investment was so huge and it is so important. So although it's not all here in the detail, I do want to make sure that we don't start doing a whole lot of things badly, and you know, maybe it's time we start going, what don't we do? And so we can focus on the other things. But I'm really worried that we do focus so much on the infrastructure, which is crucial for the whole city, but there's a lot of people in our community that A, will never buy a house, or B, will always be stuck in traffic. But while they are living here, we need to make sure there are hundreds of reasons why it's still a great place to live, a great place to enjoy in your local area. The playgrounds are great, the beaches are clean, the art galleries open, the libraries are open. We need to make sure that all the reasons why people love Auckland and living here in our communities, we keep those services great, because there will be a lot of people who don't actually end up benefiting from all the investment we do until 10, 15, 20 years. There might be whole generations that miss out on housing and things, but we want them to stay here and feel like there's good reasons to stay here despite the challenges we have. So I'm going to be looking deeply into the issues. I know we have some huge challenges, but I also want to make sure we protect the awesome things about Auckland as we go through this process. So thank you. I'll be excited to listen from the community, and I'm sure we'll get a lot of feedback across our wards, local boards, and through the media as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Through you, Mr. Chair, I'll try increasingly to narrow the scope of my comments, because Where I agree with something, I don't need to say it, and I've covered a lot of the topics before. On the $6 billion gap, Councillor, you're absolutely right. I sat down with Transport Minister Simon Bridges and said, how are we going to divide this up? And he couldn't or didn't wish to give me a figure prior to the election, and I understand that. But what he did say to me was that he thought the government would meet the most significant part of it because they had the headroom, and they had the headroom because they're taking more and more petrol tax out of Auckland as we add 800 extra cars a week to the road. So I'll have the same expectation of the new government as I had of the old, and you know, I suppose my starting position is what we are putting in is the extra amount we're taking from Aucklanders who are paying the regional petrol tax when people in other parts of the country aren't. Beyond that, it's a little bit like the America's Cup. We don't have money to throw at anyone, and you can't spend money you don't have, and that means that we'd have to do less if the government was demanding that we had to pay a whole lot more. We'll be reasonable in our discussions and our negotiations, but I think it is fair, as Simon Bridges said, the government has got the headroom. It's taking the road taxes off Aucklanders in increasing numbers and increasing amounts. Secondly, I agree with your point. The harbours are indivisible. It might be tempting to say, well, and if you've got a beachfront property, generally you've got a very high value on it. But actually, all of us do enjoy the harbour, and you can't just pick on particular communities. I've used the example time and again. There are little communities around Auckland that if they had to clean up their own, say leaking septic tanks, they would never be able to afford to do it. So that doesn't mean to say we try to get blood out of a stone or we don't clean the mess up. The harbour belongs to all of us. Of course, we'll clean the mess up. The third thing, just to make absolutely clear, I'm not advocating that we charge entry to the art gallery for New Zealanders or Aucklanders, but they tell me 60% are international visitors. They're often in tour groups. We've done it at the museum and got quite a lot of money back from international visitors. And, I see no argument at all why Aucklanders should be paying rates simply for the enjoyment of people that don't pay taxes and don't pay rates in New Zealand. So I'm not trying to demonise them. I'm just simply saying mostly those are people who in their own countries accept that they would be paying to go to an art gallery, and our rules should line up. Thank you very much for your comments.
I'll just point one thing out. Mayor Goff has remembered the Manukau Harbour and also the Kaipara. We have three harbours that have all got issues. So.
Absolutely. I lived much of my life on the Manukau. I never ignore it.
All right, Councillor Sayers.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you for my birthday wishes, and you, Mr. Mayor, thank you very much for that. I certainly do want to acknowledge you, Mr. Mayor, and your office for getting this onto the table for us to discuss and work through in more detail on the 11th. So congratulations to you and your team. Also would like to acknowledge the Chair of the Finance and your Deputy as well, as long as the local boards that have and the councils that have all had input into this. I would like to make special mention of Matthew and your team. The amount of work that goes into this we probably don't fully appreciate, but to get here to this point today is a great effort. Whether we agree with everything or not, that's the whole idea of it, getting it to the table. So thank you for that, and your team, if you could pass it on. I just want to cut straight to one of the points in here. It's point number 27 to do with the transport, and just looking through those priority lists. The first thing that struck me, being a rural councillor, was the urban focus there. And I'm not going to go into detail, Mr. Chair, but in terms of the rural needs, there are some very important ones, and I'm worried that they're not reflected, A, as a priority in this plan, and probably not reflected in the detail of the budget in terms of any increase in the programme. I do believe I have a duty of care to speak on behalf of the Aucklanders who are most disadvantaged group of ratepayers, and I want to put on record my disappointment of not protecting the health of the elderly, of the very young, the unborn, those with pre-existing heart and lung diseases, and those with asthma and diabetes. Reading through this document and listening to the debate today, I feel that we're putting more, although important, we're putting more importance on the health of kauri trees than we are on the health of Aucklanders, and particularly the vulnerable people of Auckland. The International Agency of Research on Cancer has classified dust as a carcinogen based on potential lung cancer. And consistent with that, the World Health Organization has endorsed those thoughts. And I wonder, and the reason why I'm bringing this to attention, although I've written to all of you in an open letter, is just reinforcing the importance of this and the liabilities that go with this. As was mentioned a bit earlier about corporate companies and our responsibility as councillors and governors of Auckland. And let's not forget that the bigger regional picture as well. So, you know, Auckland Transport has tried to do a seal extension program to stay within a budget. They've had to extend the money that they have had to do some sealing on Waiheke, and the costs have gone up from 450,000 a kilometre, Mr Chair, to over 1 million per kilometre. So the longer we wait, you know, and there's no extra kilometres sealed in that in terms against target, but it's costing us a lot of money. So those are my quick comments there. Overall, I think in reality this budget will hurt the very people that can least afford it, because it won't change housing affordability, house prices, won't change the rents and the resultant social outcomes and implications of that. I think the pockets of Aucklanders are going to be hit, and they're going to be hit hard. And I look forward to the 11th, Mr Chair, and that's why I asked my earlier question, because I think the devil is always in the detail. So I look forward to examining the entire budget in detail and working through it potentially on a line-by-line item. So thank you for allowing my input.
Thank you, Councillor Sayers. Councillor Cooper.
Oh, do you want me just to comment on it? Yeah. Just quickly, Mr Chair, sorry not to hold the proceedings up. Thank you for acknowledging officials, Councillor, and if I can do the same, and officials in my office that worked really hard on it. It is a marathon effort. Councillor, on point 27, the most important word is the word include. This is not an exclusive list. It's simply a list of a number of the priorities, and I've put it in there to demonstrate those priorities are in all parts of the city, north, south, east and west. In terms of unsealed roads, one of the roads that isn't in that is Mill Road. I lived on Mill Road for 6 years when it was unsealed. I know all about unsealed roads. We're spending more on sealing roads, I understand, from the Deputy Mayor than we've ever spent, and I make no apology for that. The thing that I disagree with is the councillor's comment that this will hurt those who can least afford it. There's nothing in this document that I believe will hurt people more that can least afford it. We've set out to achieve some degree of equity in this, and in some of the changes we've made, they've been made on the grounds of equity. So I'm happy to listen to anything the councillor says at the next meeting, but I'd need to have it spelt out how it was hurting people who could least afford it. Things have to be paid for. If we're not going to pay for it one way, please, councillors, give me the alternative suggestions that you're proposing to raise the money, because I think we can't just sit around this table and say no to something, because that might appeal to a particular group. We've got to say, if not that, then something else. I'm always happy to look at alternatives and would welcome receiving any alternatives from the councillor.
Councillor Cooper.
Thank you. In breaking news, we still will be looking after Rodney and Waiheke. So for your birthday, Councillor says you won't be the Mayor of Rodney. So my commiserations. So we still have to, so we still have to provide for those areas.
With
so
all that debt.
Yeah.
Got the birthday wish.
So yes, and goodness knows how much that process has cost us. So first, absolutely, look, in our Councillor House in my ward, the health of our forests, our coastal area and our lagoons is paramount for people. So my hope is that they'll understand and they'll be able to transparently see what they are paying for us to do something that's not just a want but an absolute need to clean up our area in that regard, and we'll all be contributing right across the region for the different parts that need to be sorted out. I agree with you, Mr. Mayor. I have no problem with us charging for tourists at the gallery. We do it at the museum. We do it in the zoo. You know, you go to any. I've just recently been to the Gaudi Museum in Madrid. You know, wherever you go overseas, you pay the MoMA, every MoMA there is in every city. You know, I think we have to look for other ways of gathering revenue. We can't keep putting it on the ratepayers. Because for a lot of our ratepayers, they do not go to places like the galleries. They just don't. So I think it's important that tourists pay their way. The most important thing I want to speak to is around the petrol tax. Yes, it's great, you know, our budget's only 2.5% increase, but we're just putting the cost somewhere else on the petrol tax. And I acknowledge there's probably no other way to do this, but it will affect... and I acknowledge Councillor Newman's comments about people in South Auckland. You know, people that sometimes have to have 3 and 4 cars to get to different shift work all over the place. However, in South Auckland, there's huge employment areas. If you look at West Auckland and you look at the heat map about local access to employment, it is one of the hottest areas in more ways than one. You know, West Aucklanders, over 60% of them have to go out of area to work. We don't have a northwestern busway. Huge parts of West Auckland do not have access to the train. In the northwest, there's nothing. There is one ferry, but already we're struggling to make that into a transport hub because some local people don't want to change anything. So, you know, we've got issues there. These people will be paying more, and they're often poor families who do go to South Auckland to work. They go to the airport. They go to the factories down there. And they have to sit in the traffic for a long time. And I absolutely acknowledge that some of your priorities are Northwest Mass Transit and Lincoln Road. However, that is years away. You know, people will still be sitting there, and even though there's been fantastic work done with the Waterview Tunnel already, we have masses of freight now using that tunnel, which blocks up. And we've also got huge growth in Kumu and Huapai, where those people are just flooding onto the motorway, and it's really hard for the people downstream to get on. It took me 35 minutes to get 3 kilometres this morning to get on the motorway. And I only live 20k from the city. But the ferry doesn't afford me the hours that I work to get there and back either. And so for me, yes, I acknowledge that it's the only way, but it will be significant costs to low-paid workers in West Auckland. And so that is going to be tough for them. It's another pocket, but it's the same pair of trousers. So, you know, there's lots of things in here I applaud, but it's still going to be tough for Aucklanders. And until we can really, you know, and you know, the government do need to step up and fill that funding shortfall for transport. So Aucklanders don't have to bear the brunt of all of it, because this city and region contributes hugely to to New Zealand's success. So I hope there is a big dollop from the government. But apart from that, you know, I pretty much support this. There's never everything you're going to agree with, but I'm here to actually make things move forward, not be a roadblock. Thank you. And I'm happy for you not to comment, because in the interest of time...
I've commented directly to the councillor before the formal session, so maybe I'll waive that right. Thank you, councillor. I take on board your points.
Councillor Holz.
Just a question. Thinking about the kind of discussion that we've had, on the 11th, are we going to have, you know, the Mayor's responded because this is his proposal. When we take the next step and sort of dig down into the detail, will we be able to interrogate our staff and our CCOs directly on these issues?
Yeah. Yep, and including in the workshops. And remember, in the past, we have actually reached some agreement in the workshop on alternative amendments or whatever we put up to go to the 11th. So sometimes we can actually get harmony and agreement on alternatives at the workshops, and then we don't necessarily need to debate and interrogate as deeply on the 11th, because we're saying, right, that's fine, we're going to go out and consult on that as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think that's really important, because there's quite a lot of issues I can already see a bit of, you know, horse trading, for want of a better word, can probably actually resolve some of these issues. And just thinking of Councillor Cooper's point, which I thought was an excellent one, the pair of Auckland trousers is pretty stretched, and there are many pockets that are being dipped into, but the problem is that we, unless we absolutely commit our end, we're not going to get the government to put anything into those pockets to help, because at the moment our growth is benefiting the government. They rake in the money into their coffers, and our ratepayers bear all the cost of growth. And I think we're starting to hopefully turn that picture around. But I think Linda's right on the mark with her comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll just comment briefly on the last thing Councillor Hulse says, because she's absolutely right. In some of those environmental areas, if we put money in, we get matching funds from central government. So for every dollar we put in, we actually get $2 worth of value, and we shouldn't overlook that opportunity.
Right, Councillor Filipana from the south side.
So sweet. Wow, interesting listening around this. So Councillor Hulse has covered one around the 11th in the process, especially talking to our CCOs. As some of you are aware, I will not be here on the 6th and 7th because I'll be travelling overseas on council business, and that's within the policy. So I will not be here, but I will be back on the 11th. Yep, definitely. Double B. Best of business. I'll be travelling.
Not a council expense. He was going to add.
Sorry, yeah, there's a double B. I didn't know there was one. Yeah. No, there's not. So, just to let you know. So look, both Councillor Collins and I, our two local boards are the lowest and poorest in Auckland region. And the interesting thing is having a look at the revaluations, and I looked at the average in 2014. Mangere o Tāhuhu, 37%. 2017, Mangere o Tāhuhu, 55%. Otara Papatoetoi, 2014, 35%. 2017, Otara Papatoetoi, 62% average. Our job will end up going out to the community wherever we end up settling around this, and basically talking to our communities that have your say, like everybody else around this table, and explaining to them, the regional issues. And so, look, I look forward to their input, because that's exactly what will be happening. Through you, Chair, and His Worship the Mayor has been thanked in regards to the proposal, and I join that chorus of people who have acknowledged the proposal, because as the statute dictates, you will lead that proposal, and you have your worship. I do, however, and I've spoken to Matthew around this, I do, however, want to see some work done, Matthew, if your unit can, around what could possibly be removed as a result of 2.5%. Last year at the first annual plan, for His Worship the Mayor was 2.5, and at our 2015-2025 it was 3.5. So there was $15 million that went out that could be spent. We've now come into the first year, if anything happens, and if it is 2.5, that's another $15 million. So really it's $30 million for the first year. Then we've got 45 million in year 19 to 20, and then progressively we'll be trying to catch up on what was ticked off in 15 to 25 from year 20 to 21 onwards. So Matthew, I just want to have a look and see if we can do some work around what could potentially be removed. And I know that it will be the governing body, and Auckland Council, which includes our local boards, will have an input in regards to what could be potentially moved. So, that's really my concern. Also, through you, Chair, around funding for our CCOs, and in particular ATED and RFA. This is why I'm glad that Councillor Hulse mentioned the process on the 11th, because for me, and we had at our workshop for our committee, there was Destination Auckland, Destination Auckland strategy. And I mean, for those that attended that particular workshop, the initial 10-year plan we've achieved, that's the Auckland Visitor Plan, we've achieved what they wanted, which was from 5.3 billion in 2011 to over 8 billion by 2021. Well, we've achieved it within 7 years. So look, the funding of ATED around that, and it's on the hub in regards to the local, the 10-year vision, but also around the annual plans. So, you know, that's a question for me as well around that, and the money that it brings in. RFA, it's been mentioned about the art gallery, and then I just echo the concerns that have been expressed by councillors around that. So, Matthew, for me, is just sort of having a look at it, so then we can be honest with our community and say, look, 2.5, this is what will happen. 3.5, this is what will happen. 2%, if in fact it is an option, this is what will happen. But I think it's a matter of just showing our community. So, yeah, thank you.
Just very briefly, Mr. Chair, to Councillor Filipaina, I think when we think about the impact of what rate increases will mean for people, for many people it's of no consequence, but the closer you are to the poverty line, the bigger the impact of any impost in terms of a rate increase. And I've got to say, probably when I've done talkback radio, the areas where I've got the most resistance to rate increases have often been Pacifica Radio of one station or another, because people do own their own homes in those areas, and they're often finding it really hard to make ends meet. So I'm very conscious when we set a rate increase or a decrease, what the impact is on those lowest income people. So that has been a factor in my consideration, Councillor. I can assure you of that.
Yep, and Your Worship, I have no doubt at all. This is why I also, and I have no doubt both myself and Councillor Collins goes out to our community within our two local boards.
Thank you.
Councillor Collins.
It's me, eh? Thanks, Mr. Chair. I wanted to thank Councillor Filipaina, who's touched on more of the numbers and crunched some of them. He's so good at that. I just wanted to pause for a moment and reflect on the vision and the foreword of the document. Congratulations, Mr. Mayor. I think it's going to be a well-consulted document, and much of the paper I agree with. My vision for Auckland is for a world-class city, a great place to live, globally competitive, that attracts and retains talented and skilled people. I remember when I did an exercise similar to this when I worked at the University of Auckland. I worked at the recruitment office of the university, and in those early years, it was my first job out of university. My job was to go out into lower decile schools in Manurewa, Otara, Otahu, and encourage young people to come to university, mostly of whom were Māori and Pacific. And I looked at the university's vision statement at the time, and their vision statement was to be a research-intensive, world-ranking university. And anyone who drives along Simon Street will see that the university puts itself up as one of the top-ranked 50 universities in the world. Then I compared it with what Harvard was saying, because we always like to benchmark against big universities, top universities, an Ivy League university like Harvard. And Harvard University's vision statement was to ensure that everybody who comes through these doors reaches their full potential, where we value diversity. Sir, in the vision, my key question to the Mayor and to those of us around this table is to reflect on how this mayoral LTP budget going forward, how this ensures that we get a connected Auckland, a resilient Auckland, a compassionate Auckland. The median wage in Otara is $21,000. The median wage in Devonport, Takapuna, is $85,000.
That's right.
The median wage in Ōrākei is $107,000. I work very closely with Councillor Simpson. I found it interesting that many of what our people are saying at two very different ends of the financial spectrum are asking for similar things. How can you help us get ahead? How can you advance in Auckland? That means we can build bridges between parts of the city where some have often said these are the haves and these are the have-nots. And so, sir, that's my challenge as we consider this. It's going to be publicly consulted, but my issue is, how is it going to ensure that we will connect all Aucklanders, that this is an all of Auckland position to take, that the people of Ōrākei and the people of Otara will be able to communicate in such a way where we're understanding. If you look at some of the work we've been doing as far as people who complain about the city and what they regard as safe, the research that we've conducted through our own council says that if you're tall, male, brown, and wear a hoodie, perhaps like Councillor Collins, you're seen as someone who is scary. Now, I think that we need to ensure that everything we do around this table brings our city together. And so, Mr. Mayor, congratulations on this. I agree with much of this going forward. I agree with the sentiment where we're trying to ensure that we have community and cultural facilities, where we've got public transport that works for everybody. But I hear the words of Councillor Newman. I echo the words of Councillor Filipaina, and I think it's important that we understand that we have to show a commitment to Auckland, that we will be a council for all of Auckland and not leave anybody else behind. Thank you.
Just very quickly in reply, Mr. Chairman, yeah, having an inclusive city I think is incredibly important. You've only got to look at cities around the United States to see where your low-income community is so far separated from your high-income community, they never connect, except when the low-income people enter into the high-income community with intent to take some of that wealth for themselves. I'm not justifying that, but that's not the sort of society we want to live in. I'm interested in the example of Harvard because I've got a nephew going to George Washington at the moment, and the fees are about $140,000 a year, so I don't know how you get inclusiveness when you have fees like that. But the points that you raise are valid points, but when I look at what we'll be working with the government to do on university fees and allowances, the changes already made, housing, affordable houses and more social houses, and a greater emphasis on homelessness, I think we can work together with central government, with their resource base, to tackle some of those things that would most trouble you. So thank you very much for that.
Right, well, we're losing our audience rapidly, so there's only Councillor Clow and Member Taipere to speak, so we'll be briefer. I will speak and then Member Taipere. I will say I'd like to applaud the Mayor for this proposal. And a big thing that I think is important, and Councillor Holst did ask that this get considered, is this is actually delivering on a number of things relating to the Auckland plan, not just transport, not just housing, but we're starting to look at water quality, we're looking at the environment, we're looking at pests and weeds, and starting to broaden it and deliver. And I will take my hat off for you on that, although I will say to a degree, and I will say local board investment as well. But I suppose I believe this proposal was a little bit relatively light on Maori outcomes and also on the arts and culture generally, but we'll come to that. So the other thing is, I think it's important the ongoing focus on targeted rates. We brought in effectively the second one last year, which is the accommodation one, which was quite hard work to get it in, but we've established the principle, and of course that followed the interim transport targeted rate as well. I think an important thing about those, and I do believe the public will be positive about it, is it does identify where the money's going to go, and the money does go into a pot that can't be grabbed out of another to be used in another area, and people like that transparency. So needless to say, the core focus still is housing and transport, but the water targeted rate is just long overdue to try and arrest something that's just been basically a bit of a disgrace for a long time, and we need to make that investment. And needless to say, the environmental charges, we know what's been presented to us. We are in decline in our environment. We are in decline with species eradication, and plants also being troubled by weeds, etc., etc. So that's something just we do need to put something in as to whether we're going to go with the smaller proposal or the bigger proposal or something in the middle. We will determine going forward. Important for me personally is the reinforcement of introducing capital value for those capital rates. And I know the Deputy Mayor and myself have led the charge on either side, having interesting debate over several years. And I'm not saying Bill won then and I'm winning now, but but I think it should be noticed that we're effectively moving not to the capital value, not moving that the business should be paying 32%, that there is a compromise that it's at the long-term differential goal of 25.8. So if you think we're moving from something like 14% now, which is on the interim transport levy, to something like 25.8, it's not huge, and we're making a difference there, and business is paying a fairer and more equitable amount of money. So the other thing I do want to, important for me, has been the local board initiatives, which I've driven along with Councillor Simpson, and have advocated strongly to the Mayor and his team that you need to spread the butter across the city, because it's not all about downtown, it's not all about the waterfront, and not all about transport, etc., etc. So I think, and I believe we're pretty close to delivering in one form or another pretty well for every local board, and where we think we cannot, there certainly is in the plans, and there's fairly good reasons as to why we cannot be bringing all of those few boards their considerations into the 10-year plan, but that's still for discussion. I, like a number, will be giving particular attention on the nitty-gritty when it comes to culture and arts and Maori outcomes, but the culture and arts is we need to, with the Maori outcomes, we clearly need to be delivering what we've already said we're going to deliver, but we're struggling to deliver. So we need to be focusing. It's not necessarily a matter of more money or much more money, but it's just trying to deliver those outcomes. But I will say, when it comes to the arts, I do move around in that circle quite a bit, along with a number of councillors here, and it's pretty well it's not the property that we're sweating, it's the people assets that we're sweating, whether it be the APO or the art gallery. It's very hard to retain players and to specialists. It's hard to actually recruit. All of those entities are just crying out to say, hey, we are sweating the people assets way too much, and it's going on for too long. And needless to say, any great city, which we're aspiring to be, has a sophisticated arts and culture section, and we have the uniqueness of being bicultural, and at the same time a very multicultural city, but we've got a basis as a nation as bicultural. So we should be building on that. Last two things I'll just say is I do want to applaud the greater consultation I felt that's come from the mayoral office and the mayoral team than I would say in the previous LTPs. I've appreciated that. There's been some robust debate over time, but nothing wrong with healthy, robust debate, and I'm particularly pleased to see a number of suggestions that I and a few others have made have been incorporated into the mayoral proposal, and I think it's been a nice meeting point. Last thing I say is we did talk about the fact that whether, and as Member Filipino was talking, Councillor Filipino, about whether it's 3.5. Even at what we're doing here with the 2.5 and whether it's 3.5, remember we're actually just trying to bridge from 20 billion in capital needs to 25. We've had workshops and everyone knows we actually need 32. And that's just with programs that we think are essential, let alone anything frivolous and beyond. But we're just trying to meet in the middle there. We've still got a long way to go, and then we're waiting for the government to make some more announcements that might help with some other projects or might help with our headroom on debt. So all in all, I just want to thank the Mayor and his team and the finance team for the work they've done in helping put it together. So thank you, Mayor, and thank you, finance team. So.
Thank you. Very briefly again, Mr Chair, just to pick up your last point, through the workshops we were looking at our 18.7 billion and we were working at 20 billion. We've managed to get that to 24 to 25 billion, and I think that that's a superb achievement, but thank you for your support on that. The only other thing I'll say in terms of retaining and recruiting people, the problem is actually not just in the arts and culture area or even on council. We've seen that right across the community, because as long as we're the fourth most unaffordable city in the world, we're going to lose people that can't afford to stay here. So we need to look at that macro picture, and we need to look at the other reason that people stay here. They'll stay here if they're proud of their environment, they're proud, as you say, of the richness of their culture, and we do need to work on all of those things. So thank you very much for your comments.
Kia ora,
Mr. Chairman. Ka nui te mihi ki a koe te koromatua e tēnei ahi. So I'll be very brief. Obviously, I'm going to support the recommendation and again acknowledge particularly the paragraph 57 under cultural and sporting and the line of collaboration and efficiency. Again, we delivered a report on Monday that was all about that, and we want to see value for money. We want to be able to see those outcomes realised and avoid the duplication. So strongly in support of that statement of the collaboration and the collaborative way, particularly around the CCOs and the council. On top of that, the main thing I want to say is, after being through this process more than once, it's all very nice today. The most important thing is, when we get to the 11th hour of everybody having to vote for this LTP, we do not get into the game of playing for ransom. We support it as a group to make it happen, because it is very frustrating at times to go through this process, to be inclusive of as many people as possible, to go and you have the workshops, you have the meetings, you have spent a lot of time on this, but not to get to the last day and play games. And I say that to all of us, because this plan is vital for the people of Auckland. And so, like Councillor Collins said, it should be regionally focused, not about what about me and what about my patch. Focus on the region as a whole. So when it comes to decision making, just to support you, Your Worship, is that we all get on with making the right decision together. So on that basis, Mr. Chairman, thank you very much.
Yeah. And if I just comment very briefly at the end, because I know people are anxious to get away. I think I could have given the same speech as David Typery. The PwC report I thought was a very good one, Mr. Chairman, last week. It's about delivering outcomes, not just outputs. It's about lining up the goals and collaborating between the agencies and getting them working together. And most of all, it's about spending the money. And I think you and I were both concerned when a major area like road safety affecting the Maori community, where we had a huge part of our budget unspent, and that can't happen again. So thank you very much for that. Thank you very much for your cooperation and working on what we need out of this plan for your community, and we've certainly taken it on board in what we've recommended under 56 and 57. Thank you.
So, Mayor, you actually have the concluding remarks.
I think we're finished.
The debate, if you wish. Or you've done enough?
Yep. No, I've said enough.
Okay. Well, we have a mover and a seconder, and everyone's had their chance to comment. So I'm going to put the proposal. We received the Merrill proposal for the 10-year budget, 18 to 28. All those in favour?
Aye.
Aye.
Against? Excellent. Unanimous. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.